You know, during the past couple of weeks, we've received very positive feedback and messages from you all. You appreciate that we're having this conversation of homosexuality and the Christian faith here in the church. You appreciate that we are diving deeper into these scriptures that have so often been used as a weapon against the LGBTQ community. And for some, it is even restoring their faith in the church. Just a couple of days ago, I received an email from a mom in Texas. She, of course, does not attend here at St. Luke's, but she tunes into many of the sermons on our YouTube page. And she said this. I just want to read a portion of her email to you. Brother, thank you for your authenticity. I've been raised in Texas and in church. I have struggled my whole life with not being able to live up to the expectations of the church. I struggled with church as an adult. I was told love was the basis of everything we believed, but saw so little of it in the church and Bible. My prayer has been that God would reconcile those two things. I have a gay son, and I know that was no accident. I never thought I would be able to find a church that I could worship honestly at because of my non-traditional beliefs, my questions. Thank you for really asking God the tough questions and your bravery for sharing answers. I long for the day when I can return home. Apparently she's from here. When I can return home, and even more so now that I know I have a church to come home to, St. Luke's. You and your ministry will be in my prayers. I look forward to the day when we can meet face to face and I can attend service. Until then, I will continue to watch the YouTube videos. You see, sometimes we need to be reminded that we are dealing with real people who have been wounded and betrayed and are in search of God's hope in the world. This isn't just a theological issue or an intellectual debate. You know, after the first sermon, just 2 weeks ago, the first sermon in this series, on that Sunday afternoon and evening, I got, and well into the week, I got several Facebook messages. And you all know about Facebook Messenger. You can send private messages. Many of them were referring to me as a heretic, a false teacher, demon-possessed, leading people to hell. Yeah, amen, amen. But I got one message on Sunday late at night, and it simply read this. I listened to your message this morning. As a pastor, I know you were very busy, but if you get the time, could you please call me at, and he put his number. Now, I was thinking as I was going to bed, and early Monday morning, do I really want to put the time and energy into calling this fella back? This person who I have never met, I don't know him from Adam. And he's probably going to lay into me and call me a heretic and false teacher and leading people to hell and demon-possessed. And do I really want to put my energy into that? And I'll probably turn into these debates, and they never go anywhere. My call is not to debate with you, but to love you, one of those types of things. And so Monday morning I decided, you know what? He invested the time to watch the message, and now he's reaching out, so I'm going to call this guy. But he gets 5 minutes. That's all he's getting is 5 minutes. So Monday morning I pick up the phone, and it's ringing. It's on the 7th ring, and it was good because you know how you hope sometimes that person doesn't answer? So I was hoping he didn't answer, and by the 8th ring he picks up. Hello? Yeah, hey, this is Ryan, Canaday, pastor in Colorado. You asked me to call you. He almost immediately went into tears, and he shared with me his story. He said, I'm so glad you called. You seem to be a safe person to talk to about this. I'm 57 years old, and I'm a pastor and have been a pastor for many years. And I'm gay. And I've had a partner for many years, same partner. And he said, so recently I decided I would be open and authentic with my higher-ups. I thought it was the right thing to do, and I went to them and told them what was up, and they told me to renounce my sin or else. He said, Ryan, I don't know if you understand, man. If they find out And if more people find out, well, I'm going to lose my job and I'll be homeless. And man, that conversation had a way of putting things into perspective for me. Because see, over the past couple of weeks, your all's comments have been that how brave that we're taking on this issue of homosexuality in the Christian faith, and how brave that we're preaching on this issue. And see, the truth is, I mean, that feels good. Who doesn't want to be called brave, right? That feels good. But the truth is, in this conversation, I have very little to lose. As a straight male, married to a woman, same woman for almost 15 years, 4 kids later, I have very little to lose in this conversation. But my new friend and colleague, see, he has everything to lose. Sometimes we need to be reminded that we're dealing with real people. It isn't people who have been wounded and betrayed, and they're looking for God's hope in the world. It isn't just a theological issue or some sort of intellectual debate. So I want to turn with you this morning to the New Testament book of Romans. Romans is a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the first century church in Rome. And in this letter, we get those 2 verses. There's 2 verses in this letter that have been used against the gay community. Now, so here's what I want to do. I want to start with the big picture, because when it comes to this letter of Romans, we have to understand some of the basics before we can jump into some of the particulars. And so we'll start with the big picture, and let me just give you the early reminder up front. Paul is dealing with real people who have been wounded and betrayed, and they're in search of God's hope. That's who he's dealing with. So the question I want to engage for the next few minutes is, why did Paul write this letter, and what was its purpose? So some historical data as we begin. This letter was written to a particular people in a very particular time in history around the year 55 AD, and that date is important. Hold on to that date, 55 AD, and it was written for a very specific reason. Now, in 49 AD, do you know who the Roman emperor was? Good, we stumped you. The Roman emperor was Claudius. Claudius, in 49 AD, kicked all the Jews out of Rome, expelled them, including Jewish Christians, because their leaders were causing a ruckus in the city center. They were saying radical things. Some of these Jewish Christians were saying things like, well, Jesus is Lord, and Jesus is King of Kings, and Jesus is Son of God, and Jesus is worthy of our worship. Which y'all understand, if you're saying that, you're saying the Roman emperor, Caesar, isn't Lord. Caesar isn't King of Kings. Caesar isn't Lord of Lords. Caesar isn't worthy of our worship. So all the Jews, Jewish Christians included, are expelled from Rome, and so the Gentiles were essentially in charge of many of the churches now and many of the synagogues. Now, fast forward 5 years. 5 years later, Emperor Claudius dies. So all the Jews are welcomed back home. And they found that the Christian movement was still alive and kicking without them. And the problem was, it was now primarily a Gentile Christian movement. And this created a deep conflict that ran along ethnic lines. And it was this conflicted community to which Paul writes this letter that we call Romans. Paul was writing to a fractured community in order to foster reconciliation. His ministry was one of reconciliation between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. This is the context for this letter. And remember, Paul is called to be an apostle to the Gentiles, to say that Gentiles too are welcomed into the family of God. Are y'all still with me? Good, let's keep going. Paul's primary purpose is real simple. The gospel of Jesus Christ is for everyone. Live in harmony, and for Christ's sake, stop spending all your time judging one another. His opening words in this letter, after he gets done with a typical first century greeting, he says this in chapter 1, verse 16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. And you all imagine if the Jewish Christians are hearing this, they are cheering Paul on. You tell them, Paul, first to the Jew. Wait a minute, to who? Those heathens? What do you mean the Gentiles? You mean the ones who come from the pagan culture? Come on, Paul, it's not for them. It's for us. It's not for them, it's for us. Then Paul launches into this discourse. Now, bear with me, it's about 9 verses, and Paul gets a little wordy. God's wrath is being revealed from heaven against all the ungodly behavior and injustice of human beings who silence the truth with injustice. This is because what is known about God should be plain to them, because God made it plain to them. Ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen because they are understood through things God has made, so humans are without excuse. Although they knew God, they didn't honor God as God or thank Him. Instead, their reasoning became pointless, and their foolish hearts were darkened. While they were claiming to be wise, they made fools of themselves. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images that look like mortal humans, birds, animals, reptiles. So God abandoned them to their heart's desires, which led to the moral corruption of degrading their own bodies with each other. They traded God's truth for a lie, and they worshiped and served the creation instead of the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. And then you get these 2 verses. That's why God abandoned them to degrading lust. Their females traded natural sexual relations for unnatural sexual relations. Also, in the same way, the males traded natural sexual relations with females and burned with lust for each other. Males performed shameful actions with males, and they were paid back with the penalty they deserved for their mistake in their own bodies. We'll stop there. He gets a little wordy, doesn't he? So I want y'all to imagine this church in Rome has just received this letter. And a leader in the church stands up to read this letter as they would do. And when he or she reads this letter, the Jewish Christians again begin shouting. Yeah, you tell them, Paul. That's exactly how they are. That is exactly how those heathens are, those pagans. You tell them, Paul, right on. Now, I want you to imagine Paul is standing in the back of the room. And he might stand up and say something like, yeah, I see how it is. Oh, you think they're the enemy. Oh, you think they're the problem. You've been wounded and betrayed, and now you need someone to point the finger at. You need someone to blame it on. You need a scapegoat. Yeah, of course some of them have turned their backs on God. They knew that God existed, but they stopped honoring God. They stopped thanking God. Oh, you need someone to blame it on, huh? Now remember Paul's purpose. Throughout this letter, throughout Romans, he is presenting a gospel that says God welcomes them too. It is for the Gentiles too. So understand Paul's rhetoric. Paul is highlighting Christian Jewish prejudices towards the Gentile, because what he does next is completely flip the script. So the Bible does us a little bit of an injustice when we see chapters and verses, And y'all know when Paul wrote this letter, he didn't write like chapters and verses. You know that, right? This came along later when we got manuscripts and we started organizing the scriptures, and they help us with organization. But this would have read like any letter you and I write. The very next movement, and for us it's chapter 2, verse 1, Paul is talking to the Jewish Christians, and here's what he says. Check it out. Therefore. Now, whenever you see a therefore, you got to figure out what the therefore is there for, all right? Therefore, you have no excuse. Whoever you are, when you judge others, for in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, are doing the very same things. So it is like Paul is saying to these Jewish Christians, what are y'all saying? You do the same things. Sure, you may not do the list of vices mentioned about pagan culture, but you are suppressing the truth of the gospel by your judgmental attitude and your belief of exclusion. You're suppressing the truth. The gospel of Jesus Christ is for everyone. Live in harmony together. And for Christ's sake, stop spending and wasting all your time judging one another. But we still ask, yeah, but Pastor, well, what about verses 26 and 27? You're just skirting around the issue. What do we do with those? You know the ones that read, that's why God abandoned them to degrading lust. Their females traded natural sexual relations for unnatural sexual relations. Also in the same way, the males traded natural sexual relations with females and burned with lust for each other. Males performed shameful actions with males. Yes, see, this discourse, Paul is accusing the Gentiles of being given over to acts that went against Jewish cultural customs. Remember Leviticus from last week. These things go against the purity laws, the purity codes. And remember, for ancient Jewish culture, any sexual act that does not procreate is considered a big no-no. I won't go into great detail here, but there are probably few of us here today that would ascribe to that principle. And it raises an obvious and simple question. Is sex merely about procreation? But wait a minute. Pastor, what do we do with the shameful acts? Paul is referring to those acts in conjunction with pagan, idol, temple worship, where you would have an adult male exploiting a younger male for sexual purposes as an act of worship in the pagan temples. So I hope it's safe for me to assume here that all of us here today could refer to that as shameful. But Paul's words, in Romans or anywhere else, they say nothing about loving monogamous same-sex relationships. In fact, I think if Paul were here today, he would be absolutely shocked that we are using a portion of his letter to condemn homosexuality. But I do wonder if Paul might have a very similar message for us today. Oh, I see how it is. You need an enemy. You need someone to blame it on. You've been wounded or betrayed. You got to point the finger. You got to create these categories of us versus them so you can compare yourselves to others and say, see how good I am? Look how bad they are. See how good I am? Oh, I see how it is. You need those categories. The gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news of God's love, is for everyone. Live in harmony together and stop wasting your time judging one another. And y'all, can you imagine if we used Paul's letter today not to stand against the LGBTQ community, but if we used his words from 2,000 years ago to reconcile a ministry of reconciliation to reconcile the LGBTQ community with the church. What a powerful reversal that would be. And if I may close with a rereading of Paul's opening words, Romans 1:16, the one that talks about not being ashamed of the gospel, and the words of one theologian, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Christians, then to the gays, the lesbians, the bisexuals, the transgenders. An invitation to exchange judgment for love and reconciliation." So I want to invite some friends to come forward. We have some guests in the house this morning. Lori Davis and Donovan Davis. And Jim Davis is also here. The whole family's here some of the family's here this morning. So Lori and Jim have been in my Wednesday night class. As you all know, we're doing classes to coincide with this series. Lori and Jim have been in this class. And I think it was a couple of Sundays ago when you were telling me your story. And I said, oh my goodness, could you come and share that story with the congregation? I think we need to hear this because sometimes we need to be reminded that we're dealing with real people. And so thank you for being here, Lori and her 17-year-old son, their 17-year-old son, Donovan. And the story is, I'll cut to the chase, Lori was telling us about how Donovan came out as gay a few years ago. And so I would love for you to walk through this experience with us. As a mom, how did this affect you? What did you do? How did you respond?
Well, Donovan was 12. He was in the 7th grade and had just restarted school from Christmas break. It had only been a couple days back. And he came home from school very upset about a test in math that they threw on them, and he couldn't believe they were doing it. They'd been gone for 3 weeks, and he was going to get help from a teacher from the previous year, and he was telling her that he had some things going on in his life. And I thought, wait a minute, some things going on in your life? Because that's not Donovan. He's a very upbeat, happy, easygoing kiddo. And when that flag went up, I thought we need to dig a little deeper. I need to have a bigger conversation with him. So I said, wait a minute, buddy, what do you mean things are going on in your life? Nothing, Mom, nothing, I'm fine, I'm good, nothing. And I continued to press him on it.
Mamas just know this stuff now.
Oh, I mean, so no. And we went at that for 30 solid minutes. And we would sit in silence next to each other for a while. And at one point I said, I may not be able to solve your problem for you, but I can certainly be there to bear your load and to help carry that. And I could tell when I said that he loosened up a little bit, but he was still terrified. And so by 30 minutes, I thought I need to do something. So I said, would it help you if I were to say what I think is going on? And he said, yes. And I said, well, honey, you're gay. And he said, yes. Yes. And so, we sat with that and talked and cried together. And for you to know, he's 17 now. He went from this 12-year-old terrified to tell his mom, who was so open with him about friends that I had when I was young being gay. And it was heartbreaking to have this 12-year-old child afraid to tell me, of all people. So we've gone from that to now a 17-year-old who is student body president we live in Evergreen, which you guys know is a small town up in the foothills. So we've made great strides.
Awesome. Yeah, we can applause for that. So, Lori, can you tell us a little bit about some of the, when we were talking about this, you talked to me about the grief that comes with this. Can you walk us through some of the grief?
Absolutely. While we were talking, I was crying when he told me and we had this deeper conversation, and I wasn't crying because, and I told him this, I'm not crying because I'm sad or upset or disappointed that now I have a gay son. I was sad because I knew that at some point in his life there were going to be people that were not going to be kind to him, and that I was not going to be able to protect him. And it hurt me for him that this child that God made was someday going to be treated poorly because people weren't choosing to know him. They were just choosing to judge on his being gay. The other part that was very hard, we were very involved in a church in Evergreen. My husband was a deacon in the church, and the head of a small group went to men's Bible study every week. And every now and again he would ask, what's the church's feeling on homosexuality? And people of the church, they would skirt the issue, dance around it. He was never given a direct answer. And then we got a new pastor. And he had a meeting, much like, it was a one-time thing, but much like what you all are doing on Wednesdays and Saturdays, the Bible study. And I was so excited for hearing what they had to say. We're finally going to get some answers and some support. And he came out with all of these scriptures, the clobbers, and it was devastating. Basically saying that my 12-year-old son is a sinner, and that we needed to feel sorry for people like him, and we never stepped foot in that church again. So there's also the abandonment that went along with it.
Well, I'm glad you're here, and I hope this
you.
place can be a place of home for you, for your whole family. Donovan, before we go, I want you to tell us, so lots of people tune in via YouTube. There's the camera. We have lots of moms and dads and brothers and sisters and people who are struggling and wrestling with this. If you could say something to them, or for anyone in this room who is walking through a similar issue, what word of hope would you give them?
To the person who might be struggling with their sexual or gender identity, I would, as cliche as it sounds, tell them that everything will be okay in the end. You'll find love, whether it's through your family or through the people that you choose to surround yourself with. I was very fortunate, and I'm one of the lucky few that had a supportive family, but I know that had they have not been, I would have been able to find people like you in this room right now who would love and support me for who I am. For loved ones, if somebody comes to you and wants to discuss their gender or sexual identity, I think it's important to keep in mind that you don't need to really understand it, and that's okay. Love and support do not need to go hand in hand with complete and total understanding. So I think that's just something to keep in mind, is that especially as a parent, you want to understand what your child is going through, but they're not looking for you to understand. They just want you to love them for who they are or as a friend. And so I would urge you all to really keep that in mind if you ever do find yourself in that position.
You don't have to totally understand to love.
Exactly.
How
Right.
profound is that? Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we're going to close things with this song and video called Home. And as I was thinking about my friend who said, man, you don't understand, I'll be homeless. What if we could create a place of home right here in the church for everyone? So this is called Home. Take a moment and reflect.